and also presented research papers. Now, may I request Dr. Sujit Das to engage the session.
Thanks a lot, sir, for the generous introduction. At the outset, I must thank Shivaji College for organizing this particular symposium. It's very timely intervention and very important for all of us. I also would like to thank Naganath sir for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to share some of my views vis-a-vis the impact of COVID lockdown, particularly in India and in general in the world, and the way forward. So let us focus on the topic. Sir, how much time do I have? It's 2:50 in my watch. For how long should I speak?
Sir, you can proceed for 40-45 minutes.
Okay, thank you.
Up to 4 o'clock you can proceed. But to 3:55 actually you have time. 55 minutes complete time is with you.
Yeah, but there would be a question answer session, right, after my talk?
Yeah. So okay. You can cut your presentation by 5 to 10 minutes so that we can take that Q&A part also.
Right. Thank you very much, sir. Okay.
As we wish, we can keep on for 5 to 10 minutes also.
Sure. Okay. So as far as the impact of COVID lockdown is concerned, let me begin by the GDP data which has come out recently. The National Statistical Office has brought out the quarterly estimate of GDP for the first quarter of this financial year. That is the month of April, May, and June. And it shows minus 23.9% decline in GDP as compared to the first quarter of last financial year, that is 2019-20. Now, here I would, in fact, I was writing one small newspaper article on this growth rate. So I looked at the data carefully. What the data shows is, first of all, many people got surprised by seeing this minus 24% growth in the first quarter of this financial year. But I was not surprised at all, because we were doing some primary survey based on telephonic survey in 12 states in India. I would come to that a little later. But those of us who were following this impact of COVID lockdown in India, they know that the situation is terribly bad. So minus 24% growth rate is not a surprising thing at all. Many people got surprised because of the fact that, in my opinion, our media has largely failed to report this kind of catastrophe, economic catastrophe, which was happening in the country. Somehow, I was writing, many people were writing in the newspaper and elsewhere about the disaster. However, somehow our media was focusing on other things more than what is the situation, economic situation in the country, particularly in the context of, let's say, more than 50% of population which are relatively poorer in the country. Now, obviously, we know that this is a pandemic and it is spreaded worldwide, and almost every country in the world went for some kind of lockdown. Degree may vary country to country, but they had to impose some kind of lockdown in their countries in different ways. In India also, lockdown was imposed in the last week of March, I think 25th March or so. And now it is opening up slowly, phase by phase. But during the first quarter of this financial year, that is first 3 months, April, May, and June, the lockdown was quite severe. During this time, this NSO data, National Statistical Office data, they show that agricultural sector has grown by 3.5%, which is higher than the growth rate in the first quarter of last year. It was around 2.9% last year, and this year they are telling us that it has grown by 3.5% or so. Now we need to realize that these quarterly estimates of GDP are not very reliable. These are provisional estimates, because data is collected in our country. On agriculture, we get data twice in a year for Rabi season and Kharif season. For industry, we get data, reliable data, only once in a year. That is annual survey of industry is the source. And for service sectors, we get some information annually, and some information comes in 5 years time, that is through economic census in the country. So these quarterly estimates of GDP are based on some information which are collected on monthly basis, for example, index of industrial production and so on, and some time series projections. Now, time series projections again are based on past trends in various sectors, in various sectoral GDP. So you can understand that if we make time series projection based on past data, then obviously this kind of structural breaks cannot be captured through that data, that projection, because time series projections are based on past trends and which were relatively better. So obviously the trends, the projections would be upward biased. Now, for example, just to elaborate this point, that for example, agricultural growth of 3.5%, we don't have reliable data till now on the first quarter GDP growth in agricultural sector. What do? We take the past trends of agricultural growth in different agricultural activities, and then we try to project that on the basis of some information which are available on productivity during the first quarter of this financial year. So when we do that, then obviously the growth rate, projected growth rate would be linked with the past growth rates. That way, since productivity didn't fall in agriculture, we are expecting that GDP in agricultural sector would grow by 3.5% or so in the first quarter of this financial year. However, when we were conducting these primary surveys, etc., many farmers were complaining that the production was good in this year because of good harvest and good rainfall, etc. But they could not market their product because of the lockdown. They could not take their products to market and sell them in expected price. And as a result of that, if the product is not marketed, then that does not get included in GDP. In gross domestic product, the products which are being sold in the market, only that value gets added. So I am not sure whether these provisional estimates of GDP growth in agricultural sector of 3.5% would be very reliable or not. In fact, in revised estimates, when the data would come, there would be revised estimates, and after almost 1.5 to 2 years, the actual estimates would come. So I have a suspicion that in revised estimates and in actual estimates of agricultural GDP growth, I think the growth rate would be much below than what is being predicted right now based on these provisional estimates. So similarly, if we look at the industrial sector, in industrial sector, the growth rates have been calculated on the basis of index of industrial production, which are showing scary trends. For example, if we look at the index of industrial production for steel production and for cement production, which are basic ingredients for infrastructure and so on, they are showing minus 80% growth rate. So in the first quarter, as compared to that, manufacturing sector growth rate has been calculated to be around less than minus 40%. So what they have done is they have taken some data from the share market on the corporate sector, performance of the corporate sectors. Now, during this lockdown, although production was not taking place, but share market was not performing that badly. So if we get information from share market, and if we calculate our GDP growth rate based on the data of share market, this National Stock Exchange and Bombay Stock Exchange data, then obviously again there would be upward bias, and actual growth rates are likely to be much lower than what is being predicted currently right now. Again, in the service sector, if we look at, let's say, for example, hotel, restaurants, and tourism and so on, the growth rate has been predicted to be minus 47%, which is, I mean, significantly low negative growth rate. But at the same time, we all know from our experience that during the first 3 months, that is April, May, June, during when the lockdown was really severe, the hotel, restaurant, and tourism was almost closed. So it is difficult to believe that during the first quarter, 50% of the hotels and restaurants were operating at full-fledged manner, or 100% of them were operating at 50% capacity, or 47% capacity. Sorry, 53% capacity. So in the revised estimate again on the service sector, I think the growth rates would be actual, when the actual data would come, the growth rates are likely to be much lower than what is being predicted right now. So in my view, the growth rate during the first quarter of this financial year would not be around minus 24%. It would be at least minus 40 to 50%. So that's when the actual figures would come, it would be even more lower than what is being predicted right now. So the situation is scary. And it is a great challenge. And this COVID lockdown has imposed great challenge not only on Indian economy, but worldwide. Many countries, I mean, most of the countries probably excepting China have faced negative growth rates, and negative growth rates, I mean, in the context of various countries, the negative growth rates went up to 15%, 20% of GDP in the first quarter. So in Indian context, if the first quarter growth rate be even minus 24%, which is a conservative estimate, then annualized growth rate, since there are 4 quarters in a year, annualized negative growth rate would be something around 6% only on the basis of this minus 24% growth rate in the first quarter. In the second quarter, the quarter which we are in currently, here also till now, the lockdown is not completely over. I mean, it is partially imposed in various degrees in various states. It varies state to state, of course. But in this quarter also, the growth rate, or the, let's say, the total amount of GDP would not be at par with the GDP of second quarter of last year. So in this quarter also, we would have negative growth rate. Most likely in the third quarter also, you would have negative growth rate, some negative growth rate. And maybe, hopefully, to be optimistic, in the fourth quarter, that is January, February, March of 2021, possibly we would recover, and the growth rate would be neither negative nor positive. It would be zero, or the GDP, absolute value of GDP, would be at par with what it was in the fourth quarter of last year. So that way, if we calculate the total annualized growth rate in this year of 2020-21 in Indian context, my sense is that the total annual growth rate would be minus 15 to 20% in this year. Now, somebody, I think Professor Rajput was mentioning that after 1979, we haven't experienced negative growth rate in Indian context. And that year also there was minus 5.2% negative growth rate, but immediately after that, in the next year, we had more than 6% growth rate, so economy could recover within a 1 year or so. But this time it is minus 20. Even if we assume the growth rate has been minus 25%, that is 1/4 of the economic activities have gone, and 1/4 of the economic activity means it's huge. That means, given the productivity, labor productivity does not change overnight. So given the average labor productivity of different sectors, if we face minus 15 to 20% annualized growth rate, then the employment would also come down by minus 15 to 20%. That means in our country, total size of the workforce is around, or the employed population is around 47 to 47.5 crores. And according to PLF's 2018-19 survey data, and total unemployed was something around 3 crores. So if we face minus 20% growth rate this year, that means there would be a rise in unemployment by 9 crores on top of already existing 3 crore unemployed. So within 1 year's period, the total aggregate unemployment in the country would rise from 3 crore to 12 crores, around 10 to 12 crores, which is 4 times increase within a year. And if that kind of rise in unemployment happens in 1 year at aggregate level, then obviously it is not difficult to understand that antisocial activities in the society may increase, law and order situation may go out of hands, and there would be unprecedented misery and disaster in the economy. So in that situation, that is the ground level situation today. In that situation, what is to be done? I would come to that little later. Before that, let me briefly talk about our survey results. What we have done is we have conducted telephonic surveys in 12 states in India. Our total sample size was around 3,000 families, 3,000 households, and including all the family members, total number of total population which was surveyed was around 20,000. So we have conducted these surveys in all parts of the country, in Kerala, in Telangana, in Odisha, in North Bengal, in Sikkim, in Tripura, in Ladakh, in Gujarat, in Uttar Pradesh, in Bihar, in Delhi, and so on. So here from our survey results, what we have found out is we have surveyed people from different occupations, from government servants to private sector, corporate sector employees, to the unorganized sector laborers like auto rickshaw drivers and small shopkeepers and tailors and barbers and gardeners and masons and whatever occupation one can think of. We tried to incorporate all kinds of people from entertainment industry and so on. So from this survey, we have found out, of course, our sample had a bias. I mean, it is not the representative sample of the total population of India. However, roughly it throws some light on the ground level situation, what is happening on the ground. So we have found out from our survey that almost half of the families, surveyed families, have become indebted during the lockdown period. Their income came down drastically, but their expenditure could not come down proportionately. Particularly, it is true for the poorer section of population, because poorer section of population, they spend mostly on necessities. So they could not cut down their expenditures much, but their income came down drastically. We know the story of the migrant workers, but it is not only the story of migrant workers. Migrant worker story is even more precarious, but for general people, the income has fallen at least for more than 50% of the families. Income during lockdown has become less than half. So because of that, they have become indebted. They have borrowed money from their friends and from other family members who are relatively well off, and from local money lenders, etc. And also some people are indirectly indebted. They could not pay their house rent where they are living, or they could not pay, they have taken commodities from the grocery stores, but they could not pay the bill. So they are expecting that once the lockdown is opened up, when they would get back their employment, they would start earning their income, they would repay those debts. However, if the unemployment situation becomes like that, if many of them don't get employment even after opening up, then the situation would be desperate for them. Many of them would not be able to repay the debt which they are incurring right now to run their family, and obviously it would be a desperate situation for them. In fact, we were asking the respondents that what is your expectation about future stream of income in next 6 months? Many of them, most of them were saying that it is uncertain, and it would be substantially lower than what they used to earn before the lockdown was imposed, because of the downturn in the market and so on. Now, only government employees and salaried people, they were telling that they are expecting the same income even in the next 6 months. Sorry. But most of the people are saying that their income, expected income would be much lower. Now, in some sectors, for example, tourism sector, entertainment sector, it would take a long time for revival. It is not difficult to understand that in this kind of a situation, people are scared, people are afraid. Nobody would go for tourism voluntarily until and unless some vaccine is invented and so on. So tourism sector and some states, for example, states like Kerala, states like Rajasthan, states like Himachal Pradesh, they depend heavily on tourism. And their substantial proportion of their GSDP, gross state domestic product, comes from tourism. So, and many people directly or indirectly are dependent on this tourism industry for their livelihood. So their situation, their expected income is particularly low. That is true for entertainment industry also. It's not only films, but also theater, also the dancers and singers and performers. They are, they are expecting that they would not be able to conduct any concert in near future because people would not just turn up. So, I mean, situation is really bad. Situation is really bad, and these GDP estimates are also showing that there would be catastrophic decline in the GDP. And many people are talking about aggregate demand problem. Let me briefly talk about the aggregate demand problem so that people, those who are not from economics background, they can also understand. What is the aggregate demand problem? Aggregate demand problem is basically if people lose purchasing power or if people lose their income substantially, then their demand, what they demand for the commodities, different commodities and services in the market, that would also get affected negatively. If aggregate demand, if at aggregate level, the people's purchasing power and therefore the demand for commodities and services come down, then the industries which are producing those commodities and services, they would face losses. They would not be able to sell their products at the ongoing market price. Their inventories would be piled up because of lack of demand, and their inventories would be piled up, and they would be forced to sell their products either at lower price or they have to cut down on the quantity. So in that situation, their profitability would come down. Now, investors, before making investment, they have to take money from banks or from other financial institutions at some lending rate. So it is not free. Therefore, there is an opportunity cost of investment, and investors, until and unless they are sure of some profitability over and above the lending rate which they have to pay to the bank, they would not make investment. Nobody makes investment for making losses. So these are called business expectations. So business expectations would be lower when market is down, when aggregate demand is lower in the economy. So in that, it's like a vicious trap. The moment investors would realize that there is lack of profitability in the market, they would not make much investment, and investment is addition to the existing stock of capital. Now, they are not operating, already not operating at the full capacity level of output. They have unutilized capacity in their existing industries. On top of that, when market is down, it is not rational to make more investment or to make addition to the existing stock of capital and to employ more people. So that way, if investors invest less, then obviously employment also would come down and unemployment would go up, And as a result of that, people's purchasing power would come down even further, and their demand would be even lower, and that would lower the profitability much down, down again, and that would reduce the investment again. So this is like a vicious trap. How to get rid of this vicious trap? In the literature of economics, the suggestion is that you need to give a big demand side push to the economy so that people earn money, people's purchasing power gets enhanced, and they start demanding for more commodities and services in the market, so that businesses become profitable, and investors make investment, and they employ more laborers in their industries to produce more output, and therefore again these laborers, they earn income and they start demanding for commodities and services, and the economic growth continues. So to give this big push in the economy, there are mainly two sources. One is if government spends more money. If government spends substantially more money now, by government I do not only mean central government or the union government in Indian context, but government in general, state governments and central governments and the local body governments taken together. So if they spend more money, this is called fiscal stimulus or Keynesian demand management policy in the literature of economics. If government spends more money and gives a big push to the economy, when government spends more money, somebody or the other, some economic agent in the economy, they earn that money. And when they earn that money, their purchasing power increases. Even indirectly, if government spends more money on health sector or education sector, for example, then people's out-of-pocket expenditure on health and education would come down, and people's purchasing power to purchase other commodities and services would go up. So that way, through social sector spending also, governments can enhance aggregate demand in the economy or purchasing power of people in the economy. And social sector, according to the understanding of our constitution in India, social sector responsibilities lies largely with the state governments, not with the union governments. So the state governments have to spend more money on social sector, but state governments are crying that they don't have money. They didn't even get this money which is due on account of goods and services tax. And the union government is saying that we are not in a position to transfer that money to the states because of their situation. Now we have to understand that central government or the union government is also in a very tight situation right now. Last year, before the lockdown was imposed, the fiscal deficit was budgeted in 2019-20 to be 3.3% for the union government. Now, because of revenue shortfall, the union government could not raise much revenue. As a result of that, the fiscal deficit of last year went up by more than 2% of GDP. So for union government alone, the fiscal deficit went up to 5.5% of GDP. On top of that, the state governments had fiscal deficit as a proportion of GDP around 3.5% of GDP. So that makes it 9% of GDP. Of fiscal deficit, which was there already before the lockdown was imposed last year. Now, after the lockdown was imposed, people earned less income and less profit. As a result of that, profit tax and income tax, which are called direct tax revenues have gone down drastically, and which are collected mainly by union government according to the understanding of our constitution. And also indirect taxes like goods and services tax and other indirect taxes, which are collected partly by the state governments and partly by the central government. That has also suffered because of relatively lower consumption during the lockdown. So tax revenues have suffered badly both for the states as well as for the central government due to the lockdown. So on top of this 9 to 10% fiscal deficit, which was there already in the last year, now the the revenue shortfall has gone up many folds. As a result of that, both state government as well as the central governments are in extremely tight situation. The exchequers are in extremely tight situation. Now the big push I was talking about, which is needed to be given to the economy to for revival, to recover the growth rates, etc., and employment situation. For that, government needs to spend a lot of money, at least 5 to 6% of GDP. Now, till now, what government has done is, government has announced two packages. One is Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan package, which was announced immediately after the lockdown was imposed in the month of March, but which was basically to prevent famine in the country. It was basically free ration, free 5 kg of rice or wheat and 1 kg of dal per family per month for every household, and some free gas cylinders and free, I think, 500 rupees per month per family in Jan Dhan account, those who are having Jan Dhan account. Now, we can imagine that within 500 rupees, one cannot run a family in a month. And more importantly, these 5 kg of rice, wheat, etc., they can somehow survive with this kind of food grains. But obviously, this is not any compensation for the kind of income loss that they have incurred. But government initially couldn't do much, but they announced that just to stop famine in the country, otherwise there would have been a famine in the country. They supplied, fortunately we had good food grain stock in the FCI godowns, and we could do that. After that, government announced one Atmanirbhar Bharat package, Atmanirbhar Bharat Abhiyan package, where many promises were made, but as far as increase in government expenditure was concerned, it was a huge package of 10.3% of GDP, but only 1.3% of GDP was enhancement in government expenditure. And the rest 9% of GDP amount of package was either infusion of liquidity by the Reserve Bank of India into financial system, or encouraging loans to the farmers and the small and medium scale enterprises by without any collateral, with government guarantee. They can borrow money from the financial institutions at a relatively lower interest rate. So these things, basically this encouragement of loan and increase in or infusion in potential liquidity were the main things which were announced under Atmanirbhar Bharat Abhiyan package. But in my opinion, this kind of package, of course, these steps are welcome steps, and most of the countries, they have announced packages like this, where overwhelming majority of the package was about financial things, and very less proportion was in terms of actual government expenditure increase. So these are welcome steps. However, in my opinion, these would not be able to revive the economy, because of the problem which I was talking about, that until and unless profitability gets enhanced in the economy by increase in the demand and purchasing power of people, businessmen are not going to increase their investment. What they can do, farmers and MSMEs, they can access these collateral free loans for the time being to repay their past debts, their other loans. So these fresh loans would substitute the past loans. That way, aggregate investment would not rise. However, through these windows, they would get loans at a relatively easier terms. That's what it would happen. And until and unless aggregate demand for credit increases in the banks and the financial system, the aggregate supply of credit cannot increase. Or in commonsensical term, until and unless credit is demanded, credit cannot be supplied by the banks and commercial financial institutions. So if aggregate demand for credit does not increase, and that would not increase until and unless there is profitable opportunity. Businessmen are not stupids. So until and unless that increases, the aggregate demand for investment would not increase, and these potential infusions of liquidity would not be actualized, would not be realized. So that way, most of these, packages like Atmanirbhar Bharat Abhiyan package in our country and in many countries in many other names, they would fail to revive the economy in terms of growth rate and employment. So what is to be done then in this kind of a situation? Now, many people were arguing, including Nobel laureate economist Professor Vijit Banerjee, including Professor Maitresh Ghatak from London School of Economics, Professor Jayati Ghosh from JNU, many others. From left economists to the center economists to the rightist economists, all kinds of from all spectrum of economists. One argument was coming that to revive this aggregate demand, what we have to do is we have to substantially transfer money, particularly to the poorer households. It is not 500 rupees per month. It should be at least 7,000 to 8,000 rupees per month amount of money has to be transferred, particularly to the vulnerable and the poor. For all practical purposes, in our country, 70% of the population is poor. Whatever be our below poverty line definition, etc., if we leave aside 20% richer section of population and 20% poorest of the poor, the middle 60% of population are also poor. I was looking at the data. According to that, the family expenditure of 70% of rural household is less than 12,500 rupees per month, and for urban households it is less than 22,000 rupees per month per family. So they are, for all practical purposes, they are poor. I mean, as compared to, let's say, Western society, we would call all of them to be poor. Now, all of these people, most of them were in unorganized informal sector workers, and most of them were self-employed people. Their income has come down drastically, and in future also their income is going to go down dramatically. So as a solution to this, if we have to give big push, then this money transfer is one way. Second suggestion was universalize this MGNREGS skill. This employment of last resort scheme like MGNREGS should be enhanced, and it should be also spreaded to the, not only to the rural areas, but also to the urban areas. Because when we talk about urban areas, we don't talk only about big cities like Bombay, Delhi, Calcutta, etc. Shivaji College is not located in Mumbai. I come from Bengal, but I don't come from Calcutta. I come from a smaller city, and there are a lot of smaller towns, cities, and kasbahs, and even almost rural areas where there are municipalities. According to our definition, they come under urban areas. So as high as 50 crore people are living in urban areas in India, but for them there is no MGNREGS program. There is no employment guarantee of employment of last resort program. So if the unemployment situation is going to be skyrocketing, in that kind of situation, to control the situation and law and order problem in the country, I think it is absolutely essential to spread the MGNREGS program to the urban areas as well. And the wage rate should be hiked from 202 rupees per day for MGNREGS work to at least at par with minimum wage norm of agricultural workers in the rural areas and that of industrial workers in the urban areas. And also there is this 100 days cap in a year. From one person from one family would get employment maximum for 100 days in a year, according to the present understanding of MGNREGS. That cap should be removed for the time being until and unless this employment situation becomes normal in the country. This also, if this is done, this also would enhance the domestic demand and purchasing power of people and solve the problem. The third thing which I had in mind is about the health sector. This COVID-19 pandemic has shown the inadequacy of the health infrastructure in the country. The private health institutions are charging exorbitantly high, which most of our country people would not be able to afford. So government must enhance health infrastructure. In fact, in our country, including central government and the state governments taken together, the health expenditure of government is less than 1% of GDP in India, which is a matter of shame. I was looking at the data of 200 countries around the world, and there would be hardly 10 countries who spends less than us. In fact, I remember in 2003, when this first UPA government came into power, they promised that this health expenditure should be enhanced to 3% of GDP in the country, and education expenditure would be enhanced to 6% of GDP in the country. But then also our health expenditure, total health expenditure, was less than 1% of GDP. Now also it is less than 1% of GDP. We talk about China sometimes. Interestingly, I was looking at the data. In China, the aggregate health expenditure of government was less than 1% of GDP before 2000. They have gradually increased it to more than 3% of GDP now. So it is absolutely essential that government spends more money on the health sector and makes health services affordable and good quality health services affordable to everybody in the country. Now, if government does that, then obviously people's out of pocket expenditure on health would come down, and again their purchasing power would be enhanced. That would give a boost to the demand. In fact, after 2008 financial crisis of the US, worldwide, many countries, I mean, degree varied country to country, but worldwide, many countries, almost all countries have faced some kind of slowdown in their growth rates. So that time, I remember that there was a concerted fiscal push, fiscal stimulus was given all over the world. But this time, even after this catastrophic kind of depression which we are in right now, probably governments are still not understanding the seriousness of the problem. Many people were arguing that this is comparable with the Great Depression of 1920s and 30s. But we are yet to see that kind of concerted fiscal stimulus in the world. I think it is not only the matter of India, but all over the world, there should be a fiscal boost to enhance the aggregate demand and to get rid of this aggregate demand problem. Now, once government does that, then obviously, if growth revives, if employment revives, then in the government expenditure, the future revenue flow would also improve. And as a result of, in future, fiscal deficit might come down. Otherwise, if government does not do this, then probably it would take long time to for revival. It may take 4 to 5 years after this kind of negative shock in the economy. It may take 4 to 5 years time to revive the economy. And in between, there would be unprecedented misery. There would be huge rise in unemployment. There would be huge rise in poverty and inequality. And common people would suffer badly. So what has to be done, in my opinion, is government right now should borrow money from the central banks. Since they don't have enough revenue in the exchequer right now, they have to borrow, which is called monetization, or which is called in commonsensical terms, printing money. Now, if government borrows money from the central bank and incur larger fiscal deficit, and finance that fiscal deficit by borrowed money from the central bank, and give a big push fiscal stimulus or demand side boost to the economy, then probably we would be able to get rid of this problem sooner than the later. And another thing has to be done, that is called in economics, that is called front loading of public spending. That is, whatever planned expenditure of government is there in next 4 or 5 years, that has to be spent right now, as soon as possible, within this year or the next year. If government front loads its spendings now, then that would give a demand boost for the economy, and economy would revive sooner, within 1 or 2 years, rather than taking 4 or 5 years for recovery. So monetization is the need of the hour, and our central bank, RBI, is sitting on 20% of GDP amount of foreign exchange reserve. They don't know what to do with that money, and that money is sitting absolutely idle. So RBI is absolutely in a position to lend some money to the government. And if union government borrows money, at least 5% of GDP from the RBI, and spends that liberally, and also transfers that some portion of that money to the state governments so that they can spend more on social sector, I think it would be good for the economy. So possibly government is understanding the seriousness. It's not that government is not understanding the seriousness of the problem, but they are somewhere clueless that how to manage it, what is to be done, and how to go for it. So this is the idea which I have, and many people are suggesting, it's not only me, but many people are suggesting around the globe that this has to be done. This is the need of the hour. Otherwise, the future is very uncertain and bleak. So I would like to stop here. And if there are questions, I would like to respond. If there are comments, criticisms, they are welcome. So thank you very much again for your patience and for listening to me. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Dr. Surjit Das from Center for Economic Studies and Planning, Jawaharlal Nehru University, Delhi. Sir, let me tell you that there are no questions in the Q&A section, because your entire presentation was so spontaneous, so lucid, so simple to understand the complexities and perplexities of this tough topic like Indian economy, GDP, and whatnot. So entire presentation was actually made so simple. Even for me also, I'm not a field of from the field of economics, but I'm from language and literature. But still, I could understand the very complicated terms like fiscal stimuli and what needs to be done for the revival of Indian economy after this COVID-19. So ultimately, it was a very scholarly presentation, and you during your presentation, you not only simply presented your ideas, but for me, it was a kind of a critical analysis of the governmental schemes, policies, present scenario, and what government needs to focus on the for the revival or for the recovery of normalcy or for the good economic condition of the entire nation. So really for me and for all the participants who are connected here, since there was a power outage, so I was present on other system and I had to listen. But really it was a very superb and very spontaneous presentation, even though it was oral presentation without any slides or without any technological tools. But it was you made the complex ideas of GDP and all the whole entire situation of this Indian economy, and you also provided a comparative situation with the world, and you made the entire complicated topic very simple. So really thank you from the bottom of my heart on behalf of our organization and Department of Economics. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for accepting our invitation. And thank you for such kind of scholarly presentation.
Thank you very much, sir, for the opportunity. I think it was a pleasant experience of sharing some of my thoughts. But since there are no questions, can I make one or two more comments?
Yes, yes,
if time
definitely, sir, sure.
permits. If
Yes,
time
yes,
permits.
definitely, definitely. We are running as per program schedule. There is nothing late. You can proceed.
You know, this is the problem with this kind of webinars, because we don't, we can't interact with people the way we would have done in the seminar with physical presence. So,
Yeah, right.
uh, you know, yes, I mean, as far as the GDP, I missed one or 2 points. I just want to mention those things. Now, as far as GDP data of this minus 24% growth rate is concerned, if you look at private final consumption expenditure and the investment in the economy, which is called GFCF, gross fixed capital formation, these two components of GDP constitutes more than 90% of GDP. And according to this data, which I am saying that in the revised estimate it would be even lower, according to this data, the growth rate of these two components have been minus 35%, not minus 24%. Now, then how this overall GDP growth rate has become minus 24%? Because they have shown an improvement in the current account balance, that is export minus import, that is net export, growth rate has been 165%. Why has it happened? It didn't happen because of increase in export. It has happened because our import has gone down substantially, because I mean, one of the main importable commodities for India is oil. Now, oil import has come down drastically because of the lockdown. And also we import a lot of inputs for our exportables. For example, in Surat, this diamond industry, all these, or in any precious stones industry, the stones the raw material we import from South Africa, and then it gets polished here in Surat and in Karol Bagh in Delhi and elsewhere, and then gets exported, re-exported to the developed country market, to Western Europe and America. Now, since these imports have come down during lockdown, that is why import has fallen at a larger proportion than fall in export. Export has also come down, but import has come down even more. That is why export minus import, that is called current account balance, has improved, and it was in deficit earlier. It has become surplus now, and it has improved by 165%. That is how we are seeing this growth rate of -24%. More importantly, there has been a growth rate of government expenditure by 20%. I was looking at the data, monthly data of union government. In union government expenditure in the month of April, May and June, the revenue expenditure or the current expenditure of government has increased only by 10%. However, there has been 20% growth rate in the GDP data of government expenditure. That means state government, they are assuming state government's expenditure in the first quarter of GDP has gone up by more than 25% or by around 30%. Now, this is something which is very difficult to believe, because all the states are crying for more money and state exchequers are in extremely tight situation. So this is an assumption because we haven't got the state government data yet. So when the data would come, we would have lower growth rate in government expenditure. So that way our growth rate would be even lower. And more importantly, this net export thing does not create employment. What creates employment is consumption plus investment plus government expenditure plus exports. But the way GDP is calculated according to our present norm, we deduct import from there. That is why we are getting this relatively lower negative growth rate now, which is actually much higher, and its implication for the employment is even higher. So agriculture, even if agriculture has grown at a positive rate, agricultural growth increase does not mean employment in agriculture is going up. Agriculture is a residual sector in our economy. Somebody was mentioning Professor Amartya Sen. I think Amartya Sen had a theory of disguised unemployment, which we teach our students at undergrad level even, which is the following. That is, if you don't have any other work, you go back to your village and get engaged in some agricultural activity which is going on. But ultimately what happens is, now in this kind of a situation, 10 persons would be doing the job which was being done by 5 persons. So these extra 5 persons which are getting engaged in agricultural sector are actually unemployed, but they are looking like they are engaged in agriculture. So it is called disguised unemployment in agriculture. Therefore, even if there is a positive growth rate in agriculture, that does not mean there would be more people would be employed in agriculture. If they don't have any option, they have to do something. So all these migrant workers, they have gone back to their villages from the cities and towns. So they are doing some agricultural activity, whatever their households do. That way they are getting employed, but it is not actually enhancement or increase in employment. So unemployment problem, I think, is the biggest problem which the economy is going to face, and everything is related to that, linked with that. So we have to deal with this, and macroeconomic policies are therefore important. It is not important to understand, macroeconomic policy by everybody maybe, but the government policy makers, when we talk about government, unfortunately in our country, the culture is, whenever we talk about government, we think of who is our prime minister, who is our chief minister, and who is the leader, and so on. That is the way of thinking that we have. And more importantly, we try to see which political party or which political formation is there in power. But I don't see government that way. When we talk about government of India, it is the government of India, irrespective of the party or coalition in power. Of course, it is matter. Of course, policy varies from one government to another government, but that is a matter of political science. I am not an expert in that. But when I look at government, state government, union government, and the local body governments, I don't consider which political party is in power. It is the matter of political, economic policy in the context of our country. And we criticize public policy, but these are constructive criticisms. These are not against any government or against any political party or against any particular leader. We criticize because we are more concerned about the people of this country. Ultimately, economic policy matters for them. Whether they understand or not, that's a different thing. But irrespective of which political party is there in power, I come from Bengal, there is Mamata Banerjee. So my mother was saying that Didi is doing that, Didi is not doing that, and so on. I mean, it's not Didi or Dada. It's like the policy makers of the country, they have to form, those who are experts, those who are planners, they have to formulate economic policy in the country, and all the governments, they take their advices and accordingly they act. Common people think that some leader, some bold leader, or some somebody is doing or somebody is not doing. So it is our habit to blame or give credit to our political leaders. But ultimately, I think the criticisms which I am making are for the policy makers of the country, so that they try to engage with these ideas, and it gets some reflection in the macroeconomic policy of the country, not only of this country, worldwide it is true. And common people who are suffering badly because of this COVID-19 induced lockdown, we didn't have any option also. So their suffering reduces at least to some degree. That's the hope. That is the purpose of our whatever criticism. Yeah, Sir wants to make some comment, I think. Mr. Rajput.